The proceeding will start shortly.
Good morning and welcome to the Home Affairs Select Committee. This is part one of our inquiry into legal migration. We are aiming this morning to hear from two panels, and we want to examine the impact of the government's 5-point plan to reduce net migration, to consider the benefits and disbenefits of reducing net migration in the short and longer term, and to understand what more needs to be done to prevent labour exploitation, including for those working in the health and social care sector. And we will be having a second session on this topic with the Minister for Legal Migration on the 5th of June. So a very warm welcome to our first panel this morning, and I wondered if I could get each of you just to introduce yourselves in turn for those who are watching the committee's proceedings. Professor Bell, would you like to start?
I am Brian Bell. I'm the Chair of the Government's Migration Advisory Committee and a Professor of Economics at King's College London.
I am Marley Morris. I'm Associate Director for Migration at the Institute for Public Policy Research.
I'm Madeleine Sumption. I'm the Director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford.
You're all very welcome. I wondered if I could start, Professor Bell, because yesterday there was the publication of I think it was the very quick review that you did into graduate visas, and I just wondered if you could just update the committee on the key findings from your very quick review. And then I'm going to go on and ask each of you to comment on the 5-point plan. But Professor Bell, if you could start.
So the committee published its report yesterday following a commission from the Home Secretary in March. Our conclusion was that the graduate route was fulfilling the objectives that the government had set for it in 2021 when they introduced the measure in Parliament. So the government's objectives were to increase the number of international students that studied in the UK, consistent with the international education strategy of having 600,000 students in the UK. It increased the educational exports. It allowed that talent to remain in the UK for a period after graduation. And it increased the attractiveness of our offer in the international student market. On all those criteria, the committee concluded that the route was broadly meeting those objectives and therefore recommended that the route remain in place.
And this was to allow graduates to stay for 2 years after graduation and those with a PhD to stay for 3 years.
That's correct.
That's the
with no right to settlement, so it's explicitly
limited.
Temporary route.
Right, okay. Well, Professor Bell, would you like to perhaps tell the committee your views about the 5-point plan that was announced? And in particular, I think we would be very grateful if you could set out for us your understanding of the evidence base that was used for making those policy announcements and who was consulted and in what engagement took place. We're very mindful that this was announced very quickly after the current Home Secretary was appointed, just a matter of a few weeks. So we're quite interested in that.
So I think there are three main areas. There are 5 points, but I think there are three elements to it. One is that there was a restriction on dependence of international students. So from now on, international students on postgraduate taught courses, where the biggest share of visas are issued, will not be able to bring dependents. Undergraduates have never been allowed to bring dependents, so essentially it's bringing it into line with undergraduates and distinct from research students who will still be able to bring dependents with them. I think the logic of that was just the staggering increase that we saw in dependent numbers. So in 2019, it was of the order of something like 15,000 dependents came in total. And in 2022-23, it was more like 150,000 or something, 140, 150,000.
Was that 15?
15,000. And essentially what's happened is that there's been a big growth in the market for 1-year taught master's students, and they were able to bring dependents, and so did. And the graduate route undoubtedly contributed to some of that growth. And the attraction of bringing a partner who has an unlimited right to work in the UK while studying. And so I think the government, I think quite reasonably looked at those numbers and said action needs to be taken on this. It's not the intention of the student route to provide a route for dependents. And so that was, and their own estimates suggest that will reduce immigration by around 140,000, simply because you just take the number away that we're using it. Second area was care work, and again, driven by the very noticeable rise in the number of dependents that were coming on the care route. The care route brings in far more dependents than the average skilled worker route. And so again, about 120,000 dependents were coming in on the care worker route. And so again, the government took the view that that was not acceptable. should reduce, as I say, about 120,000 reduction in immigration. I think also potentially that might help. The effect on exploitation might be mixed on that one, in the sense that it may help to reduce exploitation because it will reduce the attractiveness of the package of coming to the UK for a family, and so they may not get into as much debt bondage. The risk, of course, is that they're potentially by themselves while their family are abroad, and that may increase their risks, so it's unclear on that. And then the final big policy change was the skilled worker changes, where the salary thresholds have risen. I think it's fair to say that probably about half of the increase in the thresholds would have happened if the government had just been uprating the thresholds on an annual basis, which we've always said they should do. And then the other half is they actually raised the thresholds and made it more restrictive. In reality, the skilled worker route is therefore back to becoming essentially a graduate route. Most of the mid-skilled jobs will no longer be eligible, and the government think that that may reduce net migration by around 15,000.
You've said that the government are thinking that the restructuring the international students would reduce by 140,000, the care workers by 120,000, and this skilled work one by 15,000. Do you agree? Those are the numbers that.
So I think they'll overachieve, as it were. Those numbers, particularly on the students, the big ones are students and care. Those numbers are simply estimating what will happen because dependents can't come anymore. It assumes no behavioural response for main applicants. So essentially it assumes that every student who brought a dependent, those dependents won't come, but either that student will still come and just leave their dependents away abroad, or a different student will come. And the same for care. I think that's probably unlikely. I think there'll be larger reductions, and we're seeing that, we think, in the student numbers already. So I think if I was a betting man, I would say the government will achieve more than it expected at the time of the announcement.
And can I just ask one thing about the care workers and about the dependents? In terms of the gender breakdown, more women would be coming under that particular category, likely to need to bring dependents with them. So has there been an equality impact assessment about that, about how it affects women in particular not being able to bring dependents?
I haven't seen one.
You haven't seen
It's
one?
not our response. It's not the MAC's responsibility.
No, of course not. But you haven't
seen one from the Home Office.
Okay. Mr. Morris, would you like to comment generally on the 5-point plan?
Sure, happy to, yeah. Three comments from me. First of all, I think this is an attempt by the government to some extent to have its cake and eat it. It wants to reduce net migration down, but at the same time it doesn't want to tackle the big challenges with the higher education funding model and the social care funding model that are driving a lot of the current figures. So it's targeted, as Brian said, it's targeted particularly dependents in the care sector and in the higher education sector, and indeed it's excluded health and care from most of the increases in the salary threshold. So you've got the situation where the government's trying to dodge the trade-offs by allowing the social care route to function still and the higher education route to function still as it did. Of course, as Brian said, there might be knock-on effects because we might see a reduction in main applicants coming through those routes from the targeting of dependents. Secondly, it's worth saying net migration may fall regardless of these policy decisions. So latest signs, for instance, in the health and care sector is that the main applicants in the first quarter of 2024 have fallen by nearly 3/4 compared to the first quarter of 2023. A very big reduction before most of those policies have been introduced. So lots of things could be happening independently of government policy. Why
has there been that fall?
I think there are two possible reasons, but I'd be good to hear from others as well, actually. I think one is potentially just there could be fluctuations in labour demand, so there may just be less demand at the moment. That might change in the future.
Sector. I mean, I think as MPs we'd all say one of the key issues for us is care providers in our constituencies tell us getting staff is just so difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, there's a second reason, which could be one of the key factors too, which is that the Home Office in late last year introduced operational changes to tackle some of the abuse they were seeing in the social care sector. So they've introduced, for instance, a new kind of genuineness rule for applicants and new compliance teams within the Home Office. That could be driving some of the reduction in numbers. But again, it'd be good to get Brian and Madeleine's views on that too.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. And Dr. Sumption.
Sure. So just picking up on that particular point, I think so we're seeing this really sharp decline in the health and care main applicants this year. I think it's in the first quarter of the year. I think it's probably a little bit early to say for sure if that's a long-term trend. You know, you do see sort of blips, and especially with the policy changes, it may be that if there are sponsors who are waiting for CQC registration, you know, there are a number of reasons that maybe there's a delay and some people will come back into the system. I also, like Marley, I think that the operational changes of having more scrutiny on the sponsor licenses probably is having a significant impact. I would be surprised if the decline was exclusively due to people not being able to bring dependents anymore, just because we know that in other visa types, you look at seasonal workers scheme, for example, there are schemes that have much less advantageous conditions where employers are able to recruit quite substantial numbers of people to come to the UK. So I would be surprised if the reason was that people no longer want to come to the UK as care workers. In terms of the overall package, I mean, I would just add, I think that the overall economic impacts of the work measures I would expect to be relatively small. Partly that's because they mostly affect the private sector. Now, last year that was around 30% of skilled worker grants were going to the sort of non-health and care workers anyway. So what was striking to me about the package for work is that it's sort of is primarily focused on the private sector and doesn't really do much about, other than the dependence ban, doesn't really do much about main applicants in the health and care sector. And of course it doesn't sort of address the underlying problem in the care sector, which is the poor paying conditions for workers, which has sort of driven the demand for overseas workers in the first place. Now we'll see obviously what happens. Maybe the numbers will taper down. If they go up again, there's a possibility that we'll still be having this debate about, you know, how to address shortages in the care sector. On the point on numbers, I think the 300,000 estimate from the Home Office seems fine to me. In terms of looking at immigration, obviously the impact on net migration will be smaller than that because some of the people wouldn't have stayed permanently anyway. Now there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment about the rates at which people are staying in the UK, and they've increased for students in particular. But I would expect that if you did have a reduction of around 300,000 in immigration, that would probably translate into a reduction of net migration of somewhere more in the region of 150 to 200,000, plus the declines that would have happened anyway in overall net migration that were expected to happen because of more international students emigrating over the next couple of years, and so, maybe some work migrants emigrating, which could be sort of maybe another couple of 100,000.
Just finally, do you feel that was this work that was going on in the Home Office prior to the new Home Secretary arriving? This announcement came very quickly after he'd arrived, and I just wondered, was there consultation going on? Are you aware of any engagement the Home Office had in terms of looking at how they were going to put forward new policies on legal migration?
Yeah, you'd have to ask the Home Office about that. I'm not sure personally.
Does anybody else know if there was any consultation going on?
Just to point out that of the 5 points of the plan, one was announced under Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. So the student-dependent change was announced in May 2023, I think it was.
Oh, well, thank you for that. It's hard to keep up because there's been so many Home Secretaries as to which Home Secretary said what. Right, Tim Lawton.
Professor, the report yesterday, it's projecting some quite stark numbers, and these are big changes in numbers, which leads one to think how genuine were the increases from 2019. You just quoted then for the graduate dependents going from 15,000 to 150,000. Now, what was behind that? You mentioned an increase in one-year master's degrees. Why did that happen all of a sudden? Or was it pandering to a market where people were attracted to it beyond just it was a good master's course?
The first thing I would say is that, of course, the UK, perhaps unlike other countries, has always had a one-year master's programme as its main postgraduate. So there was nothing unusual about offering one-year postgraduate. I think there are two things that happened. One is, unfortunately, I think the government found itself in an unlucky storm in 2022 in terms of particularly net migration, in that on the international student side, the UK opened up essentially from COVID much earlier than our main competitors, so particularly Australia, Canada and the US. And it's just much more fun to be educated in person than it is online. And so quite a lot of the increase that we see, we got a chart in our report yesterday where you see this very big increase in the UK numbers at the same time as big decreases in Australia, Canada, the US. And what you're seeing now is the bounce back as those countries have completely opened after COVID. So I think, to Madeleine's point, an awful lot of the decline we're going to see in the next year, we've already seen some numbers declining. We're going to see more of that. That's actually probably separate than government policy. That's just a readjustment of the market where students get more opportunities to study abroad now. Why did universities do it? Well, I think they did it because the funding model is in crisis. So at the time, in 2012, £9,000 was set as the fee for domestic students. That hasn't changed. It's £250 more at one point, but it's basically not changed. That's a 25% reduction in real terms. I don't know really of any other business that's told you can't raise your prices when costs go up, but that's what the universities are told to do. They lose money on teaching domestic students. They structurally lose money on research because the funding councils say, how much does it cost to do research? And when you answer that question, the funding council says, we'll give you 80% of that amount. So you lose money on research, you lose money on teaching students, but domestic students, the only way you can make money is to charge international students. And so the business model forces them to do that.
Okay, I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about the high dependence of universities on various foreign students, which is obviously not healthy in certain cases. Where have most of those increases come from? Are there certain nationalities that have accounted for most of it?
Almost entirely from India and Nigeria.
What sort of proportion between India and Nigeria? Because India has always been a very big graduate source.
It has been, although when the previous graduate post-study work group closed in 2012, there was a big decline in Indian students at UK universities, which has then rebounded once the graduate route was introduced. I think, off the top of my head, I think we're now up to about 40% Indian students, about 40% Chinese students, about 10% Nigerian students, I think it is, and then a mix of across other countries. So the universities are very heavily dependent on those three countries, and all at postgraduate level, essentially.
Okay, and so there's a backlog bubble to do with COVID that you've mentioned. How flexible are these markets with other countries? So other countries taking in large numbers, are they also allowing dependents still to come, or are they making changes as well? Is somebody who's coming from Nigeria to the UK who's brought a dependent before now equally likely to go to Australia or America or somewhere else if they've got a different policy? What's the assessment of that?
So on dependents, I can't actually remember. I can't remember. I think the US allows dependents to come on the visa as a student. I don't think you get work rights on that visa. Australia and Canada allow dependents on the route. So in that sense, that offer is now more generous in other countries on that side, on the dependent side. And so that will undoubtedly encourage some people with dependents who want to bring their dependents to choose other countries.
So that would suggest that many of those students were more interested in the add-ons rather than the quality and the appropriateness of the course.
Or they may just want to have had their partner with them while they're studying.
Right. Okay, so how does that work in America if they've not got a working rights as well? Is there a marked reduction in the numbers who go there compared to other countries who allow them to work?
I could get back to you on that. I'd have to look at the numbers.
I mean, I think it is important. If this is a very fluid market, and your figures are suggesting that this is going to lead to a big reduction in those dependents, but if they're not going to come here at all, then we're going to have a student shortage, which is going to have knock-on financing consequences as well.
I mean, I think that was the point of our report yesterday, that we are concerned. So the early indications, and they are just indications at this stage, are that international postgraduate applications and turning those into actual offers and places look like they're down quite significantly for this coming academic year. Our concern is that if you also then did something on the graduate route in the short term, that would exacerbate that fall, and that would potentially cause very serious problems for universities in the short term.
Okay, on the care workers, you quoted 120,000. What was the comparable figure in 2019? I don't think you gave us that.
It didn't exist because care workers weren't eligible to use the skilled worker route.
Right, but so care workers couldn't bring any dependents.
They couldn't. There was no route for care workers from outside of the European Union to work in the UK.
So how did those come who did come? They had to have more than just a sponsored licence from an employer?
No. Prior to the changes in 2021-22, when care work was added to the skilled worker route, if you were outside of the European Union, you could not come into the UK to work as a care worker because it wasn't on what used to be called the Tier 2 work route. Now, you may have come through other routes. You may have come, for example, family reunification and then got a job in care. You could have come as a dependent of a student and got a job in care, but you couldn't come as a worker.
Okay, so what evidence is there, or we're lacking evidence, that we're going to have a big shortage then if they can no longer bring their dependents? And again,
in terms of workers in the care sector?
Yeah, and again, is there evidence from other countries which are as desperate as we are to get those workers?
I think all countries, advanced economies, are desperate to get care workers. I don't think we're unique in that. I think, so the Home Office's assessment of their policy in December 2023 said, we're going to assume that because we are desperate for workers in that area and because it's still an attractive offer for international workers to come to the UK, get settlement after 5 years, that we would be able to replace anyone who didn't come because they couldn't bring dependents with someone who either was happy to leave their dependents in their own country or was single. As we've said, as has been made clear, in the last few months there has been a significant decline in the number of people applying for visas under the health route. Whether that is the first indication of that decline, it shouldn't be, of course, because actually you should have got your application in quickly to avoid the change. I suspect there will be some significant decline in the numbers that come, because in other words, I don't think there'll be a one-to-one replacement with people who can't bring dependents with people, who want to bring dependents with people who won't want.
And can I ask if anybody else wants to come in on this as well? Doctors and nurses and the red list, there appears to be quite an alarming increase in recruitment from red list countries, which we've been quite good at in the past at avoiding. How has that come about? And what actually is the law about recruiting from red list countries? Is it just a recommendation we should avoid wherever possible, or are there consequences? I mean, I remember starkly one of the first countries I ever visited when I got elected to this place was Ethiopia about 25 years ago, and one of the most alarming facts were that there were more Ethiopian doctors in New York than there were in the whole of Ethiopia. And we don't want to go back to those days.
Yeah, I think so. The situation is there's a code of practice developed by the World Health Organization that says that, which NHS employers have signed up to, and it effectively specifies that you should not actively recruit in countries where there are health shortages. Shortages of health professionals. The issue is that with sort of modern recruitment online, the code of practice doesn't prevent people, if you're from Nigeria, say, you can apply to an individual vacancy that's posted online and would still be able to get that job, which in some sense makes sense in that it's one thing to go and actively recruit, whereas it could potentially be discriminatory to say if you are Nigerian you're not allowed to work in the health service, and there are other reasons. There may be people who've already left those countries, or there's a lot of complexity and possible discrimination associated with saying that there is certain national, simply because of your passport we won't hire this person at all. So the focus was on active recruitment. The problem is that this doesn't work so well anymore because it's so easy for people to apply online.
So there's no restrictions on somebody from a doctor or nurse from a red list country applying for a job and being accepted by my hospital trust or anybody else's. There are no consequences of that, as long as under the code of conduct you don't go to Lagos and sort of set up a stall and saying we need to recruit your doctors and nurses, for example.
Yeah, that's my understanding, yeah.
So it's rather pointless then, isn't it? If the red list is going to grow and grow, potentially.
Well, I think that's why we've seen so many people recruited from red list countries is that, you go onto the NHS jobs website, it's very transparent now where the jobs are, and obviously that's a good thing for many workers, including UK workers, but it does mean that that old mechanism of the code of practice is probably going to be much less effective.
Okay, thank you.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to ask some questions around the changes to the minimum income requirement and the impact that you think that would have. So I just wondered if, Dr. Sumption, if perhaps you could tell us first whether you think that will significantly reduce net migration.
When you say the minimum income requirement, you mean for family
yes.
Visas? So in the context of all of the changes announced, I think the impact of this on numbers is likely to be relatively small, just because family migration made up around 7% of overall non-EU immigration, according to the ONS stats in the most recent data that we have. The Home Office estimate is that it could have an impact, they say, in the low tens of thousands on numbers, although it's very difficult to say at this stage, because we don't know also how many people may qualify through other means, such as having significant savings. In terms of the impacts, I think they will obviously be very significant for the individuals concerned. Under the 18,600 threshold, you could earn that kind of money with a minimum wage job. There are obviously going to be lots of people who simply cannot get a job that earns even 29,000, and certainly not 38,700. So I think, in some ways, for me, as part of the looking at the package of measures, that was actually the most surprising one. Some of the work salary thresholds are, reasonably mainstream by international. And, some countries have, lower thresholds, but it wasn't sort of off the charts. Whereas I think the family, if you do an international comparison, the family policy that is proposed here is off the charts. I'm not aware of any high-income country that has anything, that would exclude such a high proportion of its citizens from sponsoring someone from overseas.
Do you think it will have an impact on the number of families taking the 10-year route?
Yes. There is a lot of uncertainty at the moment about, so if people are already in the UK, then there are more options for them to get leave to remain in the UK with exceptional circumstances than if they're coming in. And those people then, so my expectation would that you may then have people coming in and dropping below the threshold, or here for other reasons, and then making a family application and getting leave on the 10-year route. So that would increase, which obviously then increases the costs for that family. There is basically no transparency around what happens with entry clearance for exceptional circumstances. We asked the Home Office through Freedom of Information request recently, and they said that they didn't know how many people were granted entry clearance for exceptional circumstances.
I think it's just worth saying that the Home Office itself has said that while currently only several hundred such claims are made a year, it's likely a greater proportion will no longer meet the threshold based on earnings alone, and so rely on the Article 8 rights, which means you'll have more people on the 10-year route. So the Home Office itself, in its assessment, actually suggested that there will be more people on the 10-year route. And we've done some research suggesting that people on the 10-year route are particularly vulnerable to poverty because they have to pay extensive fees every 2.5 years.
A family's income to keep on that route, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the impacts, as Madeleine said, are likely to be quite small in terms of overall net migration, but for individuals you could have lots of people who are still in the UK, they're still coming, but they are just on a longer route to settlement, having to pay fees, not necessarily having access to any welfare support, and obviously at greater risk of poverty. And again, lots of families of children, so at risk of child poverty as well.
Do you think it's a disproportionate policy?
Yes, I think the increase in the family income threshold is significant, as Madeleine said. It doesn't strike me as reasonable why you would attach the final threshold is matched with the new threshold for skilled workers. There doesn't seem to be a clear rationale for that. It seems to be out of step with kind of international comparisons, and as I said, could have this kind of detrimental impact on some individuals who are still coming to the UK. So no impact on net migration, but just will be at greater risk of destitution.
Can I just see, when we had a debate on this the other week, the Minister seemed to suggest that what the government was trying to do was dissuade people from reaching the end of that 10-year route, at which point they might be able to claim benefits. Does that seem entirely unreasonable as an objective?
So extending it to make it harder for people to get benefits after that
10-year period, yeah.
Well, I don't think that ultimately achieves anything, because I think most of those people are likely to stay in the UK for the long run. So for their integration, it makes sense actually to make those settlement routes more quickly. Lots of people can apply for a change of conditions, so they can access welfare. So if anything, it makes more work for the Home Office, because when they're destitute, they then have to apply. Yes. Or indeed for local authorities who then need to provide support under the Children's Act when they become destitute.
Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think that there is a really interesting question about how the threshold was set, and why it's not obvious to me why you would conceptually why there's any relationship between the threshold for the skilled worker route, which is skilled people coming here for work, and family migration. So, I mean, I think if you were to think about it as what is a rational process for setting the threshold from scratch, you would think about, well, what is the actual goal and how do you achieve it? So, there's a sort of interesting disconnect about the way the policy is described in terms of ensuring that people are self-sufficient, and then a threshold that's based on the earnings of skilled workers. Because if you take it literally, then you would be saying effectively 70% under the 38,700 policy, 70% of British people are not can't support themselves, which is a sort of
interesting message, certainly. Yes. Bill, do you have any kind of particular things to add to this conversation?
Just to say that, obviously, building on Madeleine's point, it was the MAC themselves who recommended the minimum income requirement in 2012 following a government request. And we explicitly set the level to be consistent with essentially no burden on the public purse. And so we essentially looked at what you would have to earn to not be able to claim in-work benefits of any type, and that was why the number was as it was. Unfortunately, the government didn't uprate that number over time. Again, this gets back to a basic gripe we have all the time, which is if you set a number in nominal terms, you should uprate it every year. When benefits are going up, you should be updating that number. So some of the increase would have occurred anyway if the minimum income requirement had just kept pace. But Madeleine, the key point is that the methodology that we used and in the end was endorsed by the Supreme Court cannot be used to justify this threshold. And so the government will need to come up with a justification for the threshold that is based on evidence, and thus far they haven't done so.
You consulted on the threshold?
We were not, no.
Were you surprised at the level it was set?
I was surprised by the level it was set at, yes.
Okay. Could I ask just finally, from my own experience in the casework I see in my office, there's a lot of complexity around applying for family visas. There's a lot of time wasted as well. Do you think they represent good value for money, given the amount of money people are having to pay for them?
Well, clearly, they're extraordinarily high fees at the moment, and they don't remotely reflect the kind of the unit cost for the Home Office in terms of actually processing those applications. As I said, there's also the change of conditions applications. There's options for people to apply for fee waivers under certain circumstances, but again, that's an additional kind of administrative cost for the Home Office, and lots of people aren't necessarily aware of when they can apply for fee waivers. And fee waivers aren't available for settlement, so people might get to the end of the 10-year route, but then they can't actually afford settlement. So obviously and it's worth saying that lots of the people on the 10-year are people who haven't met the family thresholds, as we were saying, so they are more likely to be less well off. So they're a particularly vulnerable place, and it seems illogical to kind of to ask them to pay more when because they have to pay additional fees for those 10 years when they are by definition more likely to be have lower incomes.
And I just wanted to check that nobody's seen a full impact assessment of these changes, have they? I'm just checking that it's not come out yesterday. No. Okay, so nobody's seen this. Okay. James Daly.
Thank you very much, Chair. Professor Bell, is it the stated objective of the British government to attract the brightest and best to UK universities?
Yes.
Okay. Now, looking at your report, and you tell me if I'm wrong in respect to this, it says that certainly suggests, I'll say, that 41% of graduate route visa holders earn less than £15,000 a year. Is that correct?
At certain points in their graduate, I think it's a difficult one to answer because I think the most useful way of thinking about it is to look at their earnings after a year in the labour market. Because when they first join, of course, you might get a very part-time job in a pub just as a starting job. And so I think our focus is more on after a year on the graduate route.
But let's just take year one.
Yep.
Is it correct?
For the whole year, yes.
Well, and therefore it does seem to me that those two things are completely and utterly contradictory, and that the graduate visa route is not achieving the aim to which the government has a very clear and stated objective. Would you agree?
I would say that it was one of the objectives of the government, and I think it's dangerous to pick and choose which objective you want to focus on. The government also has an objective of achieving 600,000 international students in the UK.
Do you think it was the aim of government policy that they would bring in the visa graduate route so that 41% of people in year one would earn £15,000 a year?
You'd have to ask the government.
Well, it's clearly not, isn't it? So
Don't know.
if the government were to reform the graduate route, because it seems to me that it needs to be reformed, could I just ask your view on the introduction of a price floor? So that if we had courses, say, that cost £15,000-20,000 a year, that is the best way to ensure that 2-year visa-free access to the UK labour market is effective in terms of the government's objective behind the policy.
You're suggesting that you should only be able to go on the graduate route if you paid higher fees.
Exactly.
So that would be an option for the government. I would say, and to caution you on this, you may be looking at one of our tables later on in the report where we show average fees per university. They were from that data is from 2020-21. There's no more recent data. Actually, all of those fees will have increased significantly since then. So I think there's an awful lot of universities that are already charging about £15,000 for postgraduate courses. So I think...
So in terms of answering the question, that I've asked you a question about a price floor. It could be 15 or 20,000, it could be 25,000, whatever it is. That is the best way for the government to achieve to obtain their objective regarding the brightest and best contributing to the economy in terms of the 2 years visa-free access to the labour market. It's a very simple and straightforward way to achieve that, isn't it?
Well, it's not. So first of all, that implies that best and brightest is also equivalent to richest. I don't think they're the same things myself. You may, I don't. And secondly, I go back to my basic point. You're picking one objective that the government has and saying that's the only one that matters. If you restrict the visa in the way you're suggesting, you will not achieve the objectives set out in the National Education Strategy. That is, as I understand it, government policy.
Okay. Looking at the wider impact of the graduate route, and I'm looking at your report, and one of the points I am assuming, just a general point, I don't think anybody can possibly argue with this, is that there must be a point in terms of adding to the skills base of the UK labour market and adding to the economy and the value added. Now, I've looked at your report, and it seems to me absolutely crystal clear that the graduate route doesn't offer any value to the skills of the UK labour market at all, does it?
I don't think. I think that's broadly fair. Yes. In the sense of, if you're asking, had we been asked the question by government, do you think the graduate route is necessary in addition to the skilled worker route to bring skilled work into the UK? Our answer would probably have been the arguments are less compelling. That wasn't the question the government asked us. The government asked us, given the objectives we set for the graduate route, has it achieved those objectives? And the answer to that is yes.
And I complete that, but we're asking you our questions to the Home Affairs Select Committee.
That's fine.
And I just want to clarify this point, because this is a matter of grave concern to my constituents and people throughout the country. It is correct, whatever one's view of the graduate visa route, there is not one piece of evidence that says that the graduate visa route adds value to the skills of the UK labour market, is there?
I mean, there is, in the sense that if you look at our chart on chart 2.3 of our report, you can see that actually compared to UK domestic graduates, a year after starting on the graduate visa, comparing with UK graduates 15 months after graduation, actually the larger proportion of international graduates earn in the top bracket. Now, there's also a larger proportion earning in the bottom bracket, so it's actually the middle that's being squeezed. But there are actually some very high achievers on the graduate route, and we can see them switching into the skilled worker route at the end of their 2 years. So it is retaining some of that talent. So I don't think it's at all fair to say there's no evidence at all. There is some evidence.
Okay. So the best case scenario is that a very small number of people are adding to the UK labour market skills base. I mean, in terms of value added for the British taxpayer, in terms of the cost involved in this, it is not benefiting the economy in a reasonable and proportionate way compared to what it is supposed to be achieving, is it?
It depends what you think it's supposed to be achieved. I go back to my point. You think it should only be achieving one thing. That's not what the government thinks it should be achieving.
I mean, I as a Member of Parliament, perhaps it's an unfashionable viewpoint, think that if you are going to create a graduate visa route, the whole point of that is to widen and expand the skills base of the UK economy, so to grow the UK economy. The best that, Professor Bell, you can say is that for a very small number of people, very, very small number of people, that may well be the case, but it has no significant effect, the graduate route, on skills, on the skills base of the UK economy at all, does it?
It has a small effect.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair.
Kim Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, panel. Professor Bell, you've mentioned that the 5-point plan is likely to achieve the government's objectives in terms of reducing net migration. However, to the detriment we've had to the social care sector and to universities, and I just wanted to know what work has been undertaken to do a level of assessment, just how much detrimental impact that's likely to have.
None that I'm aware of.
None that you're aware of. Okay, because Unison, the union that organises in the health and social care sector, calls these policies disastrous in terms of the impact it's likely to have on social care workers, particularly those that work for precarious organisations, and they lose their job, then they're faced with likely deportation and then having to pay ongoing visa fees for every other job that they want to go to. So I just wanted to know what work has been undertaken to look at some of those unscrupulous organisations who exploit these workers.
I mean, to be fair to the government, one of the key changes that was introduced in December was to require that going forward, all workers coming in on the care visa would have to work for CQC registered employers. I think that and that will somewhat reduce the number of migrants who come in on the route. So it does reduce net migration, but it does also begin to introduce an element of dealing with exploitation. And I think, so I think the government deserves credit for introducing that restriction. That means that there is an element of regulation within the sector that's being applied. So I think that's a positive. I think on the broader question, it will depend, for the care sector as a whole, it will partly depend on this currently unknowable fact, which is, are care organisations able to, as it were, still recruit the numbers they want of people who either don't want to bring their dependents with them or don't have dependents? And that's really very unclear at the moment. And I think it will take a number of months into the new year, into the new financial year, when the restrictions are actually in place, to see whether that's having the effect that that's the risk that exists.
Marley, would you like to come on that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think agree with Brian. It's good to see that the government introduced that new rule around CQC registration, but I think there's a lot more that could be done and that isn't touched on. So, for instance, we think there should be greater conditionality with sponsorship. So beyond CQC registration, but more rules for sponsors to ensure that they are upholding the employment rights of the people that they are recruiting. A clear code of conduct for those sponsors. Secondly, we need greater investment in enforcement, and we need a single enforcement body, so we've called for that as well, and that's obviously been on the books for a while, but we think it needs to be expedited. And thirdly, as you mentioned, there is a risk at the moment with people coming forward to report exploitation, because if the sponsor license of the organisation they're working for is revoked, then they lose their leave to remain within a short period. So extending that period, if they're coming forward to report exploitation, would help to encourage people to come forward and to tackle some of these issues.
Yeah, if I could just add, I agree. I think the operational changes will have some impact, but I think what hasn't really been addressed is some of the structural factors that make care workers vulnerable. I think, and there are lots of different things that have been proposed here. I think there's some work to be done around facilitating transfers. I don't think there's a huge amount of transparency at the moment around where the vacancies are, and so you have this odd situation where sometimes people have lost their job or have tried to leave an exploitative sponsor, or maybe the sponsor's license has been revoked, and they're unable to find a new job. They struggle to find a new job within the UK within 60 days, even though then you still have new people being sponsored from abroad. Now, under the post-Brexit immigration system, the labour market test the MAC actually recommended that the labour market test was removed. When that recommendation was moved, it was made. It was in a slightly different system with a salary threshold of 30,000 at the time. And I think there is a question about whether you want to create some kind of transparency around what the vacancies are before people are sponsored from abroad, if there are people who actually need to be able to switch employer from inside the country. And then the other, I think probably more thinking is needed around what happens when the sponsor licenses are revoked, because currently the workers then lose out if their employers exploit them, and there's some qualitative evidence that then employers can use this as a threat against the employee, saying if you complain, the license might be revoked and then you'll lose your job and you'll have to leave.
Thanks, Dr. Sumption. Local authorities are very dependent on care workers to deliver adult social care, and we know that in terms of payment terms and conditions, it's often not great. And Unison again have suggested that more local authorities are given some funding to look at unscrupulous care providers, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't have strong views on precisely who should do it. I think the resources in the system have been an issue, that there's a very, very large number of care sponsors now in a system that was not originally designed for these low-wage, high-exploitation risk jobs. And so I think there's a question of sort of the fragmentation of the enforcement arrangements, and also just the amount of resources that are going into this high-risk industry.
Well, I think we've also thought about there are ways for increasing the level of support of funding available for enforcement by increasing some of the cost for employers as well, actually. So, I mean, employers, for instance, actually pay quite low costs on certificate of sponsorships at the moment. If you compare it to the costs we were talking about earlier for people on the 10-year route, perhaps those costs could be increased to pay for an additional level of enforcement from the Home Office.
And Professor Bell, as part of the 5-point plan, it's a suggestion that we have less reliance on international workers meeting the needs within the care sector, and for us to grow our own, as it were. And I just wanted to know how you see that happening in the future, given that a lot of those jobs are so low paid and a lot of local people don't want to work in that sector.
So the MAP reported on social care in April 2022. It remains the only report, as I'm aware, that the government had never responded to when we submitted a report. They accepted essentially one recommendation from our report, which was to open the route for care workers. There's been no progress whatsoever on our main recommendation, which was unless you change the pay of care workers, you cannot deal with this problem. And it is depressing that no progress has been made. Frankly, it doesn't take a genius to work out that if Aldi's paying £12.50 to stack shelves, you're probably not going to want to work in a care home at the minimum wage. And everyone agrees with that. I see lots of nodding around the table, and then no funding is put in place to deal with it. And until that happens, we will continue to rely on immigration, and we will continue to rely on it more and more.
Thanks, panel. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thanks, Chair. Just to pick on the point that James was making about attracting the brightest and best, and what the salaries tend to be at the moment. And I do take the point that obviously the first point that they come in and the way the academic year falls and so on, and they may take a job at a pub or however it goes. I mean, my concern is a little how that affects GDP and various other things, and whether there's a knock-on effect with those figures. But just in terms of wondering how many of those actually do graduate jobs, I think Professor Bell, you were saying that some of those are high earners. But has there been some research into which universities they're coming from? So, for example, if we're looking at, say, Russell Group universities, are we seeing a higher proportion of those taking these graduate positions, whereas other universities, they've been accused, obviously, of selling visas rather than courses with dependents and so on. But are there some universities where they are taking a disproportionately higher number of these lower income jobs? And is that maybe something that could be targeted? I've seen one suggestion that you could almost license some of the better universities to have a graduate visa and others don't. So have you noticed that from your research so far? Has there anything that's particularly stood out about certain universities and certain graduates with their income levels?
Yeah. I can answer some of those questions. Some of them I'm going to say we don't have the data to be able to answer that at the moment. So on average, it turns out that about 10% of postgraduates who study at the top 200 universities in the world, which includes almost all the Russell Group universities, for example, about 10% of them go onto the graduate route. It's more like 30% go onto the graduate route from postgraduate studies at the lower ranked universities. So there is a noticeable difference in that. Part of the reason for that, actually a very significant part of the reason for that, is actually goes back to the nationality of students. That Russell Group universities rely very heavily on Chinese students who are much more likely to want to go home at the end of their studies than Indian and Nigerian students who are more interested in both the education and the work opportunities. So there's a difference there. What we can't answer, unfortunately, because the data doesn't currently exist, is we can't link those universities with the earnings that they have on the graduate route. It's feasible to do it because we've linked the graduate visa. We just haven't been able to get in time the link to the university. So we can't answer the question, does someone who went to Oxford on a postgraduate course earn more than someone who went to the University of Hertfordshire?
Okay, but we're able to link certain universities with nationalities, for example. So there's been a huge uptake in, say, one of the newer universities that tends to have a disproportionately high number of students, say, from, I don't know, Nigeria or something like that, and we're able to maybe map that out. I mean, is that perhaps the case, though?
Yeah, and we can do that. And we know the government actually themselves published some statistics yesterday where they show earnings by nationality that do indeed show that, I think US citizens were the highest earners on the graduate route. But you can't do it, you can do it by nationality, but you can't do it by university. And then the other thing I would say is that unfortunately we can't answer the question when they're on the graduate route. We don't actually know what job they're doing, we just know how much they're earning. So you can't turn that into a graduate job work, calculation. So you could earn £40,000, but you might not be in a graduate job, you might be a bricklayer.
Okay. Thank you. Does anybody else have any observations on that particular point? I mean, is the knock-on effect of this? I mentioned about GDP and so on. I mean, do we think that this is something that's going to be significant, or is this something statistically really that's not particularly affecting us? Just wondered, Dr.
Yeah,
Sumption,
I mean, I think the impacts of the graduate route are probably very small. The report suggests that it's probably a small fiscal positive because people are young and not eligible for benefits while they're on the route. I think in general, if you look at, as we've discussed already, if you look at the labour market outcomes they're okay. They're not stellar. If you look at the averages, I think it's fair to say that the graduate route has been much more successful. If you look at the objective of attracting students to universities than it has been in bringing people who have good labour market outcomes in the UK. By the time, if people move from the graduate route onto the skilled worker route, so for those who stay, their outcomes are broadly the same as domestic graduates, but not better.
Okay, so there's no benefit in that sense in the wider economic. I know we said about the government's objectives, and obviously it's getting the students in. Obviously, there's a product to be sold there, but in terms of societal wide, there is no wider benefit statistically that we've seen.
Well, I guess wider benefit, I guess, is quite broad, and you can look at things like impacts of diversity and so forth, which I won't get into. But in terms of the economics of it, I think if the only objective was labour market, then I would say it's not sort of an economic necessity that the UK has this route. I think that the objective that is being fulfilled primarily, in my view, is the one about attracting students to universities.
Okay. Though, as Madeleine said, there is likely to be a small positive fiscal impact, which presumably is worth considering.
Thank you, Chair.
Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions, if I may. Do you believe it is right that the government should have a 600,000 target for international students?
I mean, any target is arbitrary. I don't know.
In your view, do you think it is right that there should be?
I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how much impact the 600,000 target actually has, because the students didn't come because of the 6,000 target. The students came because of a combination of the education, the graduate route, the universities actively recruiting abroad.
The graduate route was implemented because it tried to aid the 600,000 target.
Right.
Do you believe the target should exist in the first place?
I think it's worth saying that obviously in the last few years, one of the key priorities for government has been to boost exports, and international education is a major service export. So from that perspective, there's a clear case for, maybe not, I don't know about this specific target of 600,000, but there's a clear case for making an ambitious target to boost exports in the education.
One would argue that exports would be around the globe rather than just India, China, and which was the other country you mentioned?
Nigeria.
Nigeria, indeed, Nigeria. Is there something about Nigeria and India that is very appealing for exports for the UK?
Well, there's no specific requirement on nationality. It's an open system. It's for people to decide if they want to come to study here with universities.
Is it not the case, therefore, that what we are really talking about here is the funding model for British universities? And that pre the graduate student visa, of course, universities were actually doing fine. We have suddenly decided that actually we should be boosting the pockets of universities by bringing in international students.
In answer to your first question, I have no idea where the 600,000 comes from. The International Education Strategy, as far as I can see, has no understanding of why it's 600,000. It just came up with a number.
Yeah, but the question was, should there be one, not if you reason why.
I don't see the point of a target unless you explain why you're having it.
You don't see a point of the 600,000?
I don't see any particular, right. Probably government should stay clear of setting targets. One thing I would say, though, is that it is really important to understand the financing model that's going on here. And it gets back to this basic point which the committee have made repeatedly, which is so often immigration is being used to solve problems that, frankly, politicians don't want to deal with. And the higher education model is one of those. The problem with the higher education model is that there was a new funding model put in place in 2012 that said tuition fees are going to pay for this because the taxpayer shouldn't, because a lot of the benefit goes to the individual, so they should pay for their education. But uniquely, we've said, and every single year we expect that service to be provided cheaper and cheaper. We don't do that for anything else, but we do it for education. That's not a model that works. And so we're crippling universities on the domestic fee side. We don't fund research for full economic costs, so universities lose money on that. So the only way they can break even is not making a profit. They're a non-profit organisation. Just breaking even is to bring in more international students and charge them a lot. Until that funding model is solved, it's very easy to say, let's just cut the number of international students. It's as if that will have no impact on the higher education sector. And I think it would be useful to start by saying, how do we deal with higher education sector funding problems? If we deal with those, many universities will say we don't need anywhere near as many international students because we're making money on domestic students. We can cover our costs then. They can't do that at the moment. So politicians have driven universities to do this.
Politicians or
officials?
The
policymakers.
Policymakers, yes. That's probably more accurate. Yes. I've been a politician now here as a Member of Parliament since 2019, and the more I've been here, the more I've realised that actually it's not the politician so much that is actually running the country, but the official that advises the politician. I wouldn't expect you to comment, of course. So, moving then on to salaries for earners as international students who decide they stay on. So I am aware, I've seen my daughters come through higher education, I've seen extended family members, and there's been this notion, of course, that everybody should go to university. It's the right thing to go to university. Blair came out with this 50% target, and you yourself have said it's not a particularly good idea to be setting targets. We had institutions that weren't universities that suddenly became universities. So you have this plethora of students who come out with a piece of paper, quite often, frankly, not worth the money it's printed on, who struggle to then get jobs, and it's not a surprise to me at all that we're talking about students, graduate students, then earning only 15,000. International students competing for jobs that British people then find hard to get themselves. Does this, from a policy perspective, make sense to you?
First of all, I would say, just to make sure that we don't underemphasise the value of a degree, it is still true that there's on average, a very large wage premium to getting a degree. So it's still, even though we've massively increased the number of graduates that graduate from British universities, it is still true when you look at the data that you get that the average person benefits from university financially. Of course, it's absolutely true, as you say, that there is a tail who it will turn out, if you take their lifetime earnings, will have been worse off by going to university than if they just got a job. And I think we need to deal. I think the government have made, to be fair to the government, I think have made significant progress in publicising that data better and actually getting, and perhaps we need to do more of that by saying to students, if you're thinking of going to this university to do this course, look at the graduate outcomes that people achieve and think about that as an investment. And I don't think we do enough of that in this country, and so I would welcome that. In terms of taking people's jobs, the numbers on the graduate route overall are very small in terms of the UK labour market size. And so it would be extremely unlikely, given all the research that's been done on immigration in general, that these migrants are having very significant downward impacts on wages in the UK. I mean, it's at most 200,000 people at any one time on the graduate route. That's a very small percentage of the UK workforce. And so it would just be inconceivable that they could have such a large effect on British workers' wages.
It does nonetheless have a negative effect on GDP per capita, doesn't it?
Probably not, actually, because, of course, GDP per capita includes all the people who don't work and do anything. So, actually, if you increase the number of people working in Britain, and most of these people on the graduate are working, actually that increases GDP per capita. GDP per worker probably doesn't go up.
The working population.
GDP per worker, won't go up because they're earning less than the average earnings.
So it has a negative impact.
Yeah, again, fairly small, but negative.
But negative. Okay, then, thank you. Do other panel members wish to comment on the questions? I see you wanted to answer, but then I think Professor Bell jumped in.
No.
To the rescue, I think.
On which question?
It was around the 600,000 target, and should it exist? And the whole point being, this is about the funding of universities, and it just seems to be another sector where government and officials seem to think that immigration is the sticking plaster that solves the problem, rather than solving to what appears to me to be a structural problem.
On the target, I agree with Brian. I think any target is arbitrary, and it's not clear. Maybe there was all sorts of work that went on behind the scenes, but it's not clear to me how that target was arrived at. I'm not actually totally sure how much impact the target has, though. It is not obvious to me that what would have happened would have been different if the target had been 500,000 or 700,000. We might have seen exactly the same thing happen. I think, as it happens, they did get to around that level, but I don't think they got to around that level because there was some kind of wonderfully centrally planned scheme that sort of landed just there. I think it's a coincidence that they happened to hit about 600,000, and you could leave the target in place and these policies, with the policy changes that we've been talking about, and we might see much lower. Might potentially see lower numbers of students. So the targets often end up actually being largely symbolic anyway.
Okay, thank you.
It's just worth saying, I think, as we said at the beginning, this is in the context of potentially quite a significant drop in international students coming in the next academic year. So I think that there's a logic to perhaps being cautious around changing the graduate route too much, because some of the impacts that the government wants on overall net migration may be happening anyway in the course of the coming months.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Tim Lawton, you wanted to come back.
Can I just on a quick point? Professor, you've mentioned targets being all a bit unnecessary and arbitrary. Would you agree that net targets are completely ridiculous because you can have no control over people leaving the country effectively?
I agree. You certainly can't hit it accurately.
And also, these figures can show very large movement. So, for example, if the Ukrainian situation was resolved tomorrow, we could see 150,000 people all of a sudden leave the country if they're minded to go back to Ukraine, it's safe to do so, which would have a very substantial impact on the migration figures on an entirely artificial basis.
Absolutely, which is why we've always said you should try and avoid looking too much at any one set of figures, and you should take a fairly long period to average out over that. And, and to be fair to the government, even if you average out the numbers over a 10-year period, you're still at 200, 250,000, 300 net migration. That may be higher than the government wants, and then policy should respond to that. It shouldn't respond to the fact that it so happened last year it was 750,000, because, as you say, part of that was because we decided to be generous to Ukraine and Hong Kong. Would we not have done that just because it would ruin our net migration number? Surely not.
We do have to draw this part of the session to an end, but I wondered, Professor Bell, if you could write to the committee in terms of the rapid review that you carried out on the composition of the new immigration salary list. We're particularly interested in what that means for employers and employees, what they can expect, and also dealing with this issue around the 20% going rate salary and what that means, what the impact of that being removed will have. And just my final question, actually, I wonder if you could answer this, is there's been a recent report done by the Centre for Policy Studies. I think a number of our colleagues were the authors of that report. And one of their recommendations was retiring the shortage occupation list altogether, rather than just creating this new opaque immigration salary list. Do you have a view about that?
So we have historically said that we would be in favour of abolishing the shortage occupation list. We don't think it actually fulfils a phenomenally useful purpose. And it suffers from the fact that it gives the false impression that we can respond really rapidly to short-term changes in the labour market. And actually, by the time the process goes on, it's already too late to have dealt with any crisis. So, that's probably best left to emergency action by the Home Office. In reality, the immigration salary list, we expect it to run going forward, is likely to be very small and likely to have very little impact on the labour market. So our expectation would be, I'm happy to write to you on this, but our expectation would be that if the government sticks with what it plans for the immigration salary list, it won't really make much difference to most employers.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
On that point, it's important, I think, to note that there was a major review of the shortage occupation list last year by the MAC, which I think at that point there was a kind of call for perhaps abolishing the list. But that was before December, which is when the government increased the salary thresholds. At that point, I think that there is more of a case for a salary list, because at that point, the salary list allows you to be for occupations to be paid at a lower than the general threshold, which becomes much more important for some occupations, because there are some occupations like chefs and butchers that are basically priced out of the current system because their median salary is much lower than the new general salary threshold. I think it's also worth saying that because of the way the government implemented this policy, it was really, really rushed through, and the MAC weren't given a chance to do a proper review of all occupations for the new immigration salary list before these new salary thresholds were introduced, which I think is kind of just generally just a bad way of doing policy. Not the MAC's fault, obviously, but it's because of the way the government rapidly introduced this policy.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. Sumption, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I agree with Brian that I think there's sometimes people don't quite appreciate how difficult it is to actually identify where the shortages are and meet them. My view is that probably it's so difficult to do that we shouldn't bother, and that if you want lower salary thresholds for certain jobs, it should be probably in more long-term. If you that there would be a list like we do currently effectively for doctors and nurses. We say they don't have to meet the salary thresholds because they're on the public sector pay scales, and there's a value in admitting those workers. I think that probably thinking about is it sensible in the long run to allow certain occupations, perhaps because of their strategic value to the UK, to have a lower salary threshold. That might be a more rational process than trying to sort of chase the shortages, which really, I think it sounds like it sounds sensible, but when you actually look at the implementation, it's just too hard to do.
Right, okay. And just very finally, for a long time, we just had one minister responsible for immigration, migration, legal and illegal. We've now got two. Do you feel that's a positive development, that we've now got focus on legal migration? Do you have a view about that, anybody?
We obviously, in the MAC, only deal with the Minister for Legal Migration. In one sense, it hasn't changed how we deal with ministers, because we used to just deal with the Immigration Minister and, of course, the Home Secretary. I think there's probably an advantage. It's a massive area of government policy, and so it's probably quite hard for one minister to cover the entire topic themselves.
Yeah, not being able to give it as much attention. I think the committee feels we've spent a lot of time on illegal migration over the last few years, and this committee has had to do that as well. Any other view?
No, I think I don't have a problem with that layout. It seems perfectly sensible.
Seems a good.
Madam Chair, there is actually a connection between the two as well, though, because one of the questions I did want to ask was, how many students do we know actually abscond once they're first registered at a university or educational establishment, who then just disappear and potentially subject themselves to exploitation as well? And how many actually then overstay their visa after they've completed the visa period itself?
Okay, well, I'm just very conscious that the Home Office don't seem to have any data about decisions that they make around exceptional circumstances, so I'd be very surprised if the Home Office had any data about that point.
The Home Office will have no data on that.
Yeah.
Overstaying historically has been very, very low on the student route. But I don't think, you'd have to ask the Home Office.
There is a link between legal and illegal in that respect.
There is, of course, yes, of course. Right, can I... sorry, yes.
Very one brief point about the link between. One thing to bear in mind is the immigration salary list is used for asylum seekers' right to work. And the fact that the list has now been restricted and basically and no high-paying jobs are no longer eligible for the immigration salary list, which leads to this slightly strange system where asylum seekers can't work in high-paid occupations because of the way the immigration salary list works. Now, maybe that's not going to be very common, but it still seems bizarre in principle that asylum seekers, can work in some low-paid occupations like care, but they wouldn't be able to ever work in a higher-paid occupation.
They shouldn't work at all.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution this morning. That's very helpful, and we will be reflecting your comments in our report that we will be writing. So thank you very much indeed. And if we now move to our second panel, thank you.
It's just a matter of the call of the scheme.
Good morning and welcome to our second panel. I'm going to ask each of you in turn just to introduce yourselves, if I may. If we could start with Ms Coombs.
My name's Caroline Coombs and I'm co-founder and executive director of Reunite Families UK, and we represent thousands of families who are separated or impacted by the family migration rules.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kate Roberts and I work at an organisation called Flex, or Focus on Labour Exploitation. We're a small UK-based organisation which carries out research and policy work to better understand the factors which create risks of exploitation and how these can be prevented and addressed.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Thomas, Senior Fellow at the Social Market Foundation think tank with a focus on migration.
Well, you're all very welcome. I think you were all in the room as well for the first session, so you heard the contributions that were made. I wondered if I could just ask each of you in turn to reflect on the 5-point plan that was announced last December and the particular issues from your organisation's perspective that you are most concerned about. And I'd also be interested to know about whether you have engaged in any way with the Home Office in the proposals that were put forward. So, I don't know, Kate Roberts, would you like to start?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think my sort of overarching reflection on the 5-point plan is that obviously it didn't have an aim to specific. Well, the exploitation was mentioned, but the plan didn't aim to prevent or address exploitation. It primarily was looking at net migration figures. So, certainly we were surprised by several elements of it. It came in the context of a lot of concern around social care workers being exploited, but the main changes, as has already been discussed by the other panel, was preventing social care workers from bringing dependents and the CQC registration requirements. So, we know that the main ways to address exploitation are to make sure that all workers have options to report exploitation without fear that things will ultimately work out worse for them. And as we've seen with a lot, and was mentioned again by the previous panel, with a lot of reporting on the social care worker visa, is that when workers are scammed, so they're brought on the promise of work. They've left their jobs, their community to come here, and then the work doesn't exist, or they're paid very, very, very badly and exploited. The impact of that is their employer's license the employer loses their license, and then the worker has 60 days to find new work. But in the interim, they're facing destitution and mounting debt. And then we also hear alarming stories of, as workers get near the deadline of finding a new sponsor, people attempting to scam them again, saying, I can sponsor your visa again, but there'll be a high fee. So what we would have liked to have seen is a focus on proactive labour market enforcement and a safety net for some of those, for workers who are exploited. So they know that if they speak to the authorities, the outcome is more likely to end up in redress for them and improvement in their situation, support to find decent work, rather than their immigration status being at risk.
And have you been able to feed in your concerns about exploitation in the labour market to the Home Office? Are you engaged in any dialogue with them?
It's been challenging to engage with the Home Office. The Home Office's Vulnerability Advisory Group was reconfigured some years ago, and we have been requesting to have discussions which particularly focus on risks of exploitation in the immigration systems of it, but that's not been forthcoming, no.
Okay, so you've not met with officials or ministers? That's not been available to you?
No.
No, okay. Okay, Mr Thomas, anything you'd like to say about the 5-point plan?
Yes, obviously, unlike the other two members on this panel, I do have a broader remit, and there's been a lot of discussion already on it today. I would say that overall, obviously, it's quite a scattergun approach, but its common denominator is clearly focused on reducing numbers, while having the least impact maybe on the positive contributions of certain parts of immigration to the UK. And I think one of the reasons that dependents have been focused on is that they're obviously a lever that can be moved very quickly, they can be directly controlled and stopped, but also, as the MAC pointed out yesterday, I think in their report on students, dependents are not really tracked by the Home Office or indeed anybody else in terms of their contribution. So we don't know what they do. So in terms of arguments about is stopping dependence of care workers or stopping dependence of students, we're focused on the impact on the students and the care workers, but what are those dependents? What have they been doing? We don't really know. So obviously, it's sort of easier to cut back on those. I could say quite a lot about social care and students and exploitation, and I'm sure we'll get on to some of that. But I just thought I would focus on the kind of private sector changes, because until the last 2 minutes of the first panel, I think there was a feeling that the private sector changes are quite small for two reasons. One is obviously a lot of jobs are not in that sector, and there's special dispensations for health and care, education, and also that some of the impact, or quite a lot of the impact, should have been made already. And of course, businesses lost their access to freedom of movement. So haven't they changed already? What's the problem here? We can get into a bit more detail, perhaps why some have changed not very much so far, and why some have already changed a lot. But I do think the changes are big changes. They are kind of fourfold. They're all linked together. There's the salary threshold change. There's the occupation-specific threshold change from 25 to 50%. That's quite a big deal. There was the debate at the end of the last panel about the SOL and the new immigration salary list, but whatever way you look at it, that has hugely reduced over the recent period, and the end of the going rate threshold discount for being on that list. They are all pretty big changes taken together, and indeed the MAC pointed that out. If you read right to the end of their immigration salary list report, they said, gosh, we actually recommended you to do away with the going rate discount. Thanks for doing that now, but we didn't realise you were going to do it at the same time you made these other changes. So I think to a point that Marley Morris paid at the end of the last panel, and indeed this is part of the student debate as well, where the MAC are sort of saying, gosh, we thought we were going to have to look at the graduate visa route, but we didn't know we were going to make this dependent restriction at the same time, is when you look at things, all together, you might then need to revisit some of the changes. And the MAC have said, well, you might want to think about this again now that you have made all these other changes. So business are now going to have to adapt to this, and business generally adapts where it gets a very clear long-term steer. So I think one of the things to look at, certainly in the private sector space, is what is going to happen after the next election. Whoever wins the next election, are the rules going to stay broadly the same? In which case, I think business will know that it is then moved to a brand new world that it needs to adapt to.
That's very helpful. And I think, are you able to say whether the business organisations, do they have access to the Home Office? And are they consulted? And are they engaged in being able to influence policy?
Yes, I mean, I think of all the six panellists this morning, I'm probably the last person to ask about access to the Home Office. In fact, one of the gratifying things of coming to a hearing like this is that I hear that it's not just me who isn't able to. Take it personally. Exactly. So I'm not taking it personally. I think one of the issues that business have is, for understandable reasons, and when I mention private sector and business, there's always this huge caveat that covers lots of different types of sectors, but also businesses within sectors. That tends to be quite disparate in how it feeds into policy, or it feeds in at such a high level like the CBI, that it's quite hard for them to represent different views. And some of these impacts of a migration system are very, can be quite specific, they can be quite inadvertent, and you need to feed in. So I think everybody, has that issue, and business more so, I think, because of things that have happened with, freedom of movement, post-Brexit immigration system, and now this, of course they try and influence, but business is always, private sector is always seeing, the world change, life change, and is maybe more in, not that we don't want the best rule set, but more in that we do need to adapt to what the rule set is. And the final point I would make, by the way, they do adapt to what the rule set is, not what politicians say it should be. So the fact that we had a lot of tough rhetoric about immigration, but an unbelievably liberal freedom of movement system, we had a lot of tough rhetoric about immigration, and then a pretty liberal post-Brexit immigration system. That's one of the reasons they didn't make many changes, right? I know we're talking about exploitation and people who don't abide by the rules, but most business world does abide by the rules, and they look at what the rules are, not at what somebody says they would like them to be.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Coombs, would you like to comment on your particular concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak to the family migration, but we were deeply concerned and quite frankly very shocked by the sudden increase to the threshold. It's fair to say that there hadn't been an increase since 2012. However, we represent a lot of families, and women in particular, who simply can't even meet the 18,600 threshold because they're looking after children as well as trying to sponsor their partner, and also younger couples or older couples. So we have an awful lot of people who were suddenly thrown into chaos. There was no impact assessment, there was no consultation. It was pegged to a skilled worker route that we were just we just didn't know where that came from. And in a space that has become so toxic in this country, and we deal with an area of migration that few people, most of the public, don't actually know is an issue. When I speak of this, about my own personal experience, because I'm lived experience, they simply say, what? But you're married, you have a child together, how can you not be able to be in this country? And the fact is, most people don't realise it's a qualified right, which is absolutely outrageous. As a British citizen, I should be able to be here in this country with my non-British partner and our child without concern, but that is absolutely not the case.
Are you able to say briefly what happened to you then? What was your personal experience? Do you feel comfortable to say that, or?
Yes. I mean, I think my situation was very different. I met my husband in Ecuador when I was living over there. We got married, and I thought, I need to get back to England before then I became pregnant, and I thought I need to get back to England before I can no longer carry a camera, because at the time I was working in television. And so I came back, and when I had the baby, I had the baby in Britain, I fell into very serious depression and had exceedingly dark thoughts. And then there was an earthquake in Ecuador where we were living, which was very serious. My husband was over here at the time, able to be here with me for the birth. And we sought legal advice, and not great legal advice, to be fair. And we were refused, and we then went on to do an appeal, which took a year. Basically wiped out the first year of my family life. And even to this day, I find it quite difficult to talk about because we were put on an exceptional circumstances route. The appeal, in 20 minutes, they overturned it and said, "This is ridiculous. You're a family. You should be able to be here."
You now offer support to individuals who are in similar circumstances and need
because
help.
of that.
Yeah.
And I was one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
So many families, most of our families are separated for months, if not years, and we've got so many families. I have my own mental health issues because of that, but we've got families who are separated, and I can't even tell you how desperate it is every single day to have to hear the stories that we hear. The depression, the anxiety, the children is the worst. Like having to listen to how children are being utterly devastated.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful to hear what was an awful experience, to help put this into context when you're dealing with families, husbands and wives and children. It's very upsetting to hear what happened to you and so many other people.
And as I say, I was one of the lucky ones, and it's so upsetting when you hear people talking about how they just simply want to be here. We have the narrative of dependence, the narrative of burden to taxpayer, and we repeatedly, against a brick wall, we hit our head saying there is no recourse to public funds. My husband has we're still on a route, by the way, and we spent, I don't know, £12,000 so far, living in, a cost of living crisis. We haven't been able to even go back to Ecuador for my son, who's now 8, to meet his family over there. My stepdaughters have to get visit visas to come here, which is expensive. So for our family to be complete, we still have to go through that hurdle as well. But it's incredible, the absolute complex, expensive, ridiculous, unnecessary pathways that you have to go through as a British citizen and settled citizens as well to be here. We've got families who are exiled. They can't even come back. Post-Brexit, they've then and a lot aren't even realising this applies to them. It's only when they turn around and think, or they have a situation where perhaps mum or dad is older, they're needing care, and when they suddenly look into it, I mean, I certainly didn't go and look at is there an issue for me and my husband to be here? There just wasn't even that thought process. It was only when we came up against it, we thought, what? This is crazy.
I think we're going to have some more questions on that directly. Tim Lawton, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Could I come on to the issue of non-UK nationals coming to work in the UK on a temporary basis, and the impact then that the changes to carer, people working in the care sector, their dependents has had. Ms. Roberts, what impact have you seen so far? We've heard about potential impact ahead of the actual changes coming in. Are you seeing evidence of that?
Well, I mean, I think the issue is that we're still in a situation where we're seeing the effects of workers being invited here to work and taking up a job in good faith, and there being very little labour market enforcement or protection of their conditions when they're here. So there's still the situation where workers, once they get here and things are not what they are promised, it's very hard for them to know how they can access redress in any way. There's what the system, the sector just remains massively under-resourced and under-regulated in terms of labour market enforcement. So there's been the change of the CQC, but the CQC don't. They look at quality of care. They don't look at working conditions and pay. They're not a labour market regulator.
What I'm trying to get at, I mean, there was certainly some stories about people coming here to work in care homes that didn't exist. Now, was that scams by people traffickers, and those people being recruited were being duped effectively? There seemed to be quite a big increase in those cases of those. So where enforcement clearly was not all that it needed to be. Where is the real abuse coming from? The people are being falsely trafficked here for non-existent jobs, or they're being trafficked here for jobs which don't come up to the quality that one would expect if they're being employed UK nationals. Where is the real abuse going on?
I think it's a number of different things. There's not one factor that's caused this crisis, because what you've done, you've got a very the adult care sector is massively unregulated. I think this is a core part of this problem. It's been underfunded for a very long time, and then on top of it, there was a lack of due diligence in the issuing of the visas, which has resulted in, as you say, people in very large numbers applying for jobs which didn't exist and being issued visas to come to the UK, and either the jobs didn't exist or the work was really not what they were promised. The workers have been left in a situation where they may have incurred really significant amounts of debt, have no recourse to public funds, and literally be looking at destitution. Now, there's not one silver bullet to solve that problem, but ultimately, the situation is really compounded by the fact that once workers arrive here and they face that situation, it's not. In this sector where there's a real lack of proactive labour market enforcement, it's very hard for workers to know where they can turn to for help, because it's not they will be threatened or be told that the effect of speaking out will mean the sponsor gets the licence revoked. They're looking at removal.
Has that improved? Because certainly I'm hearing a lot in my constituency of complaints from legitimate care homes who are having to wait ages for those for the licences to be granted, such that they can't then fill the spaces that they've got. So the job offer lapses, which suggests there's now better enforcement, although still the Home Office being very inefficient in its processes. Do you think things have changed?
They may have done. There have been, as the previous panel spoke about, that there have been. There have been changes. There should be more checks done prior to visas being issued. There are still people who are coming here and still being exploited and still left in a situation of extreme vulnerability. That is still happening now, and it's very it is particularly frustrating, as you say, at a time where there's workers here who are left without work, and there's care home providers who desperately need workers, and it seems complete, to make no sense at all.
Disconnect. Ms. Coombs, can I ask you, in terms of specifically the impact of the clampdown on now dependents coming with workers in the care home sector, are you seeing that's deterring people, or people are still coming but without the dependents that they might have been able to bring before. Are we seeing the impacts of that yet?
I mean, it's not care workers, and in that space, it's not an area that we deal with. So that's not an answer. That's not something that I can answer. We specifically deal with British and settled citizens who are here and whose partners are not from here and are coming into this country. They may be care workers, but no, that's not something I can answer, I'm afraid.
Mr. Thomas, have you any comments on that situation?
Yes, I would just say that you've I think hit a very important nail on the head, which is what one of the explanations for the Home Office in how this arose partly was that they were very cognizant of the shortages in the sector and the need to get these applications to go through quickly. So clearly there is a balancing act, but as has been said, it's a very unregulated sector. So, and because of the other things that have happened in the immigration system, you've got this strange dichotomy that it is a very unattractive job, but a very attractive immigration route, because most of those other low-paid, low-skilled routes have now gone. So there are low barriers to entry, and most of the other things that had low barriers to entry are not so available anymore. It's a very disparate, lightly regulated sector, lots of demand, which supports working by people who are here lawfully and people who are here unlawfully. So in one sense, it's a terrible job, but in another sense, it's what I would call the golden rung on the bottom of the ladder into the UK. And for instance, there's a lot of discussion in the Max report yesterday about how many international students are then going into social care. And just to a point that was made by Brian Bell, where he said, look, there hasn't been a bespoke care route before. This is quite a new thing. I think the thing to remember about the old system was that, as he said, people who worked here or who should have been working here in social care from outside the EU had come through other routes and therefore had a lot more flexibility and power in what they could do. But also under freedom of movement, there weren't huge amounts of people actually from the EU. Brexit wasn't a total disaster for the social care system. The social care system was not totally people with people from the EU, but there were people who would come from the EU. They would work in hospitality, they would do a social care job, they would go back and forth and move around. It brought a lot of flexibility to the edges of the system. But again, if those people didn't really like it, they could go in, work in a pub, or they would just go back home and then decide what they were going to do. So that landscape has changed, quite dramatically in that sense.
Thank you.
But if I could just add, it is really, we were in the context of the deep concern about the wide-scale exploitation in the adult care sector, to then see the GLAA's budget, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority's budget cut for 24-25. If we're going to be inviting people here on restrictive visas, we really need to be proactively having a labour market enforcement approach for the conditions of work.
Thank you.
Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. Kate, I just wanted to pick up on that point that you've just raised about exploitation, because we discussed that in the first panel, and you talked about labour enforcement, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about who you think should be doing that and how it should be happening.
So, I was mentioned briefly in the earlier panel, a mention of a single enforcement body for labour market enforcement, which, has been long, it's been a long promised body. We think we strongly support the idea of an effective single enforcement body. There's certain elements that would need to be included to make this effective, and unfortunately one of them is resourcing. We need to properly enforce our labour market enforcement in the UK, because at the moment not only is the labour inspector landscape just highly fragmented, so there's lots of scope for just sectors to fall between gaps. Whose responsibility is it to enforce? But while there's no enforcing, I'm afraid to say, unscrupulous employers just they can make the assessment that it's more profitable for them to exploit their workers, because the workers, particularly if they're on sponsor-specific visas, won't speak out because of the consequences we've already covered, and what's going to happen to them if there's only an immigration enforcement response in terms of compliance. The worst thing that happens to them is they'll lose their sponsor license. So we do need a situation where employers know that they will be inspected by labour market enforcement and they will be held to account. Another element, as well as enough resourcing for proactive labour market enforcement inspections, would be that we'd like to see secure reporting embedded into this, so that labour market enforcement is dealt with separately from immigration enforcement, so workers know that if they're speaking about workplace exploitation and abuse, it's going to be dealt with completely separately from their immigration status.
I mean, you mentioned that the health and social care sector is very fragmented. And I mentioned earlier about Unison and some of Unison's recommendations in terms of the work that they do within that field. And they've talked about increased roles for local authorities. And I just wondered if you had any thought about an increased role for local authorities looking at unscrupulous care sector providers.
I think there's potentially a role for local authorities, but I mean, I do think ultimately that should be in addition to having an effective single enforcement body for labour market enforcement. So we're creating, so we move away from having these high-risk sectors where there's a real downward pressure on pay and conditions. So that, yeah, local authorities could have a role in that, but ultimately, they would make up part of what would be a single enforcement body. So workers we'd like to see a situation where workers wouldn't really need to work out, do I have to go to the local authority about this? Do I have to go to HMRC? They would go to the single enforcement body and then the specialist agency, enforcement agency, would then deal with the issue.
The CQC has a much more expanded role now in terms of looking at sponsorship issues. And I just wanted to know from your point of view whether they have been adequately resourced and have the capacity to undertake this enhanced role.
I don't believe they've been adequately resourced. I would also, with all respect to the CQC, question if they're not a labour market enforcement body. Is this their expertise? They're a care quality commission. So I would have questions about resourcing. I've not heard of any substantive increase in their resourcing, but also why they would be placed in charge of labour market enforcement.
James Daly.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I ask Mr Thomas this question first? The information I have in front of me here is that Home Office granted 350,000 health and care visas in 2023 in total, including dependents, compared to 118,000 skilled visas in other sectors. So clearly we have a very top-heavy use of of granting social care visas in terms of that route into this country. Can I ask, if I was applying to come into this country and I said that I was a social care worker, what qualification would I need to prove that I am a social care worker and can work and carry out the duties in a social care home, facility, whatever it may be?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that there has been an explosion in the numbers of visas, and this is because it is a new route which started from February 2022 in a sector that is in a particular situation. And you're right that there isn't a formal qualification. There's arguments and debates within the sector of how to professionalise it more, but also how to certify that professionalisation. And they are not in place at the moment. But one other thing I would say is that there is some difference in the care sector between different types of care providers. There are huge numbers of small providers in this sector, but we shouldn't forget that there are also some very big providers in this sector, and there are very big providers who span care and health. And they tend to be much more focused on the types of people they can get in, whether a lot of the people coming in might have a background where they can work in health as well.
Mr Thomas, you answered the question, and thank you for that, in terms of you need no qualification whatsoever to come in. So in terms of the health and care visa, it is uniquely susceptible at both ends of the spectrum to fraud. We just heard Kate describe in terms of bogus employers, sponsoring people coming into the country on bogus jobs, which I can only accept at face value. But what it basically allows is people who have never worked at social care in their lives, who want to come into this country, claim they are a social care worker and then disappear within 5 minutes of coming into this country. An extremely easy route to migration status, doesn't it?
Well, I think I'd push back on the use of the word fraud. There are a number of entry-level jobs in this country and always have been, whether that's social care or hospitality, where people can work in those jobs with either minimal or no qualifications. That is not fraudulent. That's just part of the way that industry and that sector works.
If you claim that you want to come work in the social care sector, there is no qualification required whatsoever, and you have the intent that I'm not coming over to work in the social care sector, I'm coming over to take advantage of whatever that person sees as the benefits of living in this country, we are seeing the wide-scale exploitation of this route and means of emigration into the country, aren't we, through this social
I think that would only become clearer where you know what the progression of the people in social care is, because they obviously have the social care visa. They have other ways into the social care visa through different routes. But I think at the moment it's not clear. A lot of people are going to work in social care. A lot of those people might not have worked in social care before. It's absolutely true that a lot of people working in social care in this country, it's not their ideal job. And I don't think that means they're fraudulent people. They're a lot of migrants will take a job to get their feet on the ground to...
Whole opinion, Mr. Thomas, isn't it?
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just say that the final question to you, Mr. Thomas, is that when you were talking about employers in the private sector, what you were basically meaning was that it suits private sector employers to have cheap labour because it gives them better profits. The more cheap labour this private sector can import into this country, the better they are, and that's what we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years that's motivated the reasons why care homes and others will take advantage of this.
Yes, I don't think I did say that, but I don't think I would necessarily disagree that business are obviously focused with the costs of people they're employing and would like to employ, a most effective cost employee.
Kate, can I just ask, in terms of just following on, I think you used the phrase, forgive me if I got this wrong, a lack of due diligence in the Home Office in terms of processing social care visa applications. So not only do we have the situation that I've described to Mr. Thomas, we also have a Home Office who are not carrying out the most basic tasks to ensure that these jobs exist or that these people are serious about working in the social care sector. Is that correct?
That has, there have been examples, including in the, I'm sure you're familiar with the ICIBI's inspection report into the social care sector, of licenses being offered when it's really questionable as to whether there was work, and certainly the experience of workers is that they have arrived having migrated in good faith, believing they were coming to work, and the work which was promised has not been available. As has already been referenced in the earlier panel, there, as I understand it, have been changes, some changes in the way that visas are checked, to try and address this. So I would hope things are going to improve.
Kate, you can understand, can't you, certainly I'll say from my individual, but probably from a committee perspective, that we have a system where 350,000 visas have been granted, where it seems to me that there is no due diligence at all being carried out by the Home Office in respect to that. You simply put on a piece of paper, I want to come and work at this care home in this part of the country, and you're in. That's it.
I mean, I'm not privy to the insider Home Office processes, but it's certainly of great concern that there are workers who, as I've said, have come to this country in good faith and are left in a situation where they are facing destitution and can't support themselves.
I mean, clearly that's a very unfortunate situation, but I take it would be your view that if you're saying that destitution, we should be looking at a scheme, a process whereby the British government, if they require funds, can help them go back to their country of origin if there is no job here for them, because clearly the whole point of being here has gone, and therefore it would seem to me a good idea to help and assist them to do that, wouldn't it?
My view would be that if workers have come here in good faith to work in a sector where we have a clear need for workers, we have systems and processes in place to secure fairness and redress for those workers. Yeah. So, we certainly don't want a two-tier workforce where there's one group of workers who the employer, because they have the power of being their visa sponsor, can say anything to them to threaten them not to speak up. What we need is for those workers to be able to be supported to find decent employment.
If I was a criminal listening to this evidence, I would think, fantastic. What we need to do is bring somebody into the country, bring their dependents in on a completely false prospectus, and then they can disappear when they're in this country because there's no job, and we can bring them within the black economy. And essentially what that allows is a criminal free-for-all for people to do whatever they want. And I think it's incredibly dangerous for us to go down that route. We cannot have a situation where, because of fraud, because of overt fraud, we are therefore allowing people to stay in this country. It seems utterly bizarre to...
So what appears very clear to me is we need a system whereby workers who are in this country are supported to remain legal, remain visible, remain incentivised to go to the authorities for assistance because they know it will work out well for them.
And you and I both know that's never going to happen in a million years, is it?
I know that where workers want to remain, workers do not want to be driven into exploitation and underground. So what we need is a system where workers feel confident that if they go to the authorities for assistance, it will work out well for them.
Thank you very much.
Listen to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to say, first of all, I have a constituent who's ended up in this situation where he's come over here to work and the job has not been there for him, and then has been plunged into this uncertainty of trying to find something else. So I understand some of the issues that you're talking about. Can I ask what the situation would be for Scotland? Because obviously the CQC doesn't have any remit in Scotland, and the care sector in Scotland is regulated under the Care Inspectorate and the Scottish Social Services Council.
So apologies, I don't actually know the answer to that. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm just kind of curious as to whether there had been any discussions on that as well. Because I note that the MAC report on care services reflected that Scotland has a lower take-up rate for care worker visas because the sector has higher remuneration and a professionalisation as well under the workforce strategy that we had. Would that be a better model to implement for the rest of the UK?
I mean, as I say, I'm not familiar with the system, but certainly what we would want to see a driving up of standards, paying conditions and qualifications in the sector, yes.
Nothing, you were nodding.
Yeah, I mean, all to say is that from what the MAC have written, it is very clear that, yes, they think that would be the Scottish approach is a better approach, but that's reading their one line and around their one line.
Thank you. Moving to the issue around family visas, which I wanted to ask about in a bit more detail. You'd said that the policy coming in had obviously been quite a shock, it had been quite sudden. There was a particularly difficult period for my constituents, certainly between the announcement being made and then the slight changes and nuances on the policy over Christmas. Can you tell us a wee bit more about what you were dealing with the folk that you deal with in your organisation over that period?
Yeah. We had. There was no consultation. It came just for Christmas, which was a very lovely Christmas present for our families, which is already a difficult time for those who are separated. And obviously, first of all, it was announced, and there wasn't. We didn't know whether it affected people who were already here, like myself included, and then obviously. There was a turnaround, and it was going to be for people who were coming into the country, as if that was okay. We've still got lots and lots of families who simply just want to be a family and cannot be a family, and it was horrendous. Christmas was literally blighted once again. the Boxing Day of the previous Christmas, there had been an article in the Times alluding to the fact that there may be changes to the family migration threshold, and then nothing said since. And we do have engagement with the Home Office, and so we were quite very surprised that there was no forewarning, there was no consultation. We are known for what we do because we specifically deal with this area. As an organisation, 4th of December, we had steady 2,500 members. Between then and now, we've got over 4,600 members. It went up massively, and every single day we have new members coming. And there are so many people who don't even know that we exist. And when they come to us, they're like, how did we not know you exist? We are so grateful and thankful that you are here, because they are lost, they are scared, they are vulnerable, and they cannot understand why they're being targeted this way.
I had much the same experience in terms of the emails that I've received from people as well. It's been quite difficult for lots of folk and hearing those stories. How do you regard the move from the 18,000 to the 29,000 and then this potential further threshold to 38,000?
As I mentioned earlier, we have members, especially women, who are trying to juggle childcare, trying to juggle a job, whilst also trying to raise money for the extortionate fees, and who are they weren't even meeting the 18,600. So to suddenly raise it to 29,000, which half the population wouldn't earn, was crazy. When it first came out at 38,700, we just didn't know what to think about that, because such a vast amount of the population don't earn that money. And what it's basically saying is you and your family are not welcome here because you don't earn enough, you're not good enough, you're not worthy, so toddle off, go back to your partner's country or stay in your partner's country. And what an awful message, and equally the impacts of that on the children is absolutely unacceptable and simply outrageous. You know, children that are being devastated. And also what we're saying to the next generation, that go off, go work abroad, go travel abroad, but don't you dare fall in love with somebody because you won't be allowed back here. And I think most people should be very worried about that their children will be blocked out of family life here, and they may suddenly find themselves unable to see their grandkids and their children.
Do you think it's, how do you feel about the notion that it only really affects the income of one person? It doesn't take account of the whole family potential income from the partner's earnings?
Yeah, I mean, the first application, it absolutely falls on the British or the settled citizens' shoulders, and that's a massive, massive pressure. We've got partners who are IT engineers, software engineers, teachers, chefs, tradespeople, and regardless of what they actually do for a living, they work and they want to contribute. And when they come here, they are not dependents, and quite frankly, it's massively insulting to be regarded as a dependent. My husband was like, he was a businessman who, when he got here and was able to work, he went to factories. He didn't care what he did. All he wanted to do was provide for us. And that gets completely overlooked. And let's just wheel out the narrative of being a burden to the taxpayer when, again, I repeat, no recourse to public funds. And even if there is the very small chance that gets lifted, I mean, there's about 2.5 million of people who have no recourse to public funds. There's 2,500 of those actually were successful. And the exceptional circumstances route, it's so exceptional, nobody knows actually what is exceptional, and there are children who are being devastated, and that is not classed as exceptional. We don't know how many people, freedom of information request was done, which we heard about earlier. there are no stats on that. Well, if it's a provision, why do we not have figures on how many are applied for? What we do know is that there's going to be a lot more demand on that, which means there's going to be a demand on the Home Office. There's going to be fee waivers, which we know there's already a backlog because people can't afford the fees. They're extortionate. The administration costs versus what we pay and we don't get back when we're refused is outrageous. Given we are struggling with putting food on our tables, people not being able to pay bills, you've got mums pushing themselves crazy because they're trying to sponsor their partner, and it's deciding. I've had some people say, I'm struggling to eat because I'm making sure my kids eat.
I've had situations putting these things on credit cards as well and being massively in
I went
debt.
into massive debt, credit card debt, just to be able to keep us afloat. At one point, I regarded myself as quite a successful, in my career. At one point, we were in a caravan in my friend's garden with a 6-month-old baby because of this. And I was like, how did it come to this? Outrageous.
Yeah, absolutely. Share your concerns about this, it's awful. Can you tell me what extent will this increase have on the number of families that are opting for the 10-year route now?
Well, people aren't going to be able to meet the 29,000. It's as simple as that. And we don't even know how many people are affected because there are so many people who couldn't even meet the 18,600. So, how much that's going to push up those that are affected, and then seeking exceptional, which is expensive. It's an onerous application process, and we don't even know what constitutes, as I mentioned, what exceptional actually is. The bar seems so very high. And it's a 10-year route, as I say, so that's thousands of pounds, and it's making people vulnerable. And we've seen how quickly the goalposts can be shifted, and how that can devastate families. So, the number of exceptional circumstances will no doubt go up. And in fact, I was on a call with lawyers who were specifically going through exceptional circumstances as an application process because they recognise just how much need there's going to be, and they were specifically saying, you need to get your head around this route because there's going to be a lot. And that is just going to have a massive impact on the resources from the Home Office, who are already struggling.
And on top of the visa fees itself, you have the immigration health surcharge as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular views on that and the impact it has?
Yeah, so, we paid on application the surcharge, and then when my husband's able to work, he pays national insurance and he pays his income taxes, and so we're effectively double taxed. And when we get to the end of our route, which is actually a 7.5-year route, because what they also do is they have a stop the clock mechanism. So when you do meet the minimum income requirement, which we did, and we had no idea that this was the case, so we just went along with our 2.5-year route, went to say, right, we meet it, even though we'd met it before, and they said, we're just going to now put you on the 5-year route, but that means we're going to put you back to 0. So the 2.5 years we'd done no longer mattered, and so we were on a 7.5-year route randomly. And there's been an acknowledgement in the Home Office that that is not a fair element of the policy.
Thank you. Just wanted to know if Kate and Jonathan had anything to add on these issues.
Not from me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark Olongi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm slightly loath to sort of come to you here, Mrs. Coombs, sorry, because you've spoken a lot about your personal experience, which I find eminently relatable, but I also acknowledge through my own personal experiences that we live in a rules-based society, and whilst I think it's important as policymakers for us to hear where perhaps those rules might not be right, need changing, I'm not actually hearing suggestions coming from the panel that would actually do that, because the inference of everything I think you've said is that what we have at the moment just simply doesn't work and you prefer it to be very different, but you don't say what, because something has to be there, because otherwise what we're talking about is a complete free-for-all. Now, I know that a lot of the countries that people come from have rules themselves. So if you wanted to go and live and work or become a citizen of that country, try Australia. It's tough. And there are reciprocal arrangements. I mean, I am married to a Brazilian, South American as you are. I have extended family. My father's Italian, and a lot of my extended family is from all over the place. So I could actually sit there as a witness just as much as you, Mrs. Coombs. So whilst I really don't want to comment on your specific case, you have used your specific case to say just how awful the system is, but you haven't really come forward with a suggestion as to what might be productive and what might be an alternative to the to the system that you have faced.
I mean, I haven't been able to get to that point yet. But we, as an organisation, we've certainly been having discussions about what it could look like. And I mean, ultimately, our families and we agree that as British and settled citizens, there ought to be a right to be here as a family in the UK. There wasn't a minimum income threshold prior to 2012, and it seemed to be working just fine in terms of numbers. But if there had to be one, at least peg it to something like the minimum wage, where it would make it fair and it would make it accessible, and also a bit easier for the Home Office to administer as well, because it would be pegged to a minimum wage. We would like, the route to settlement is long, 5 years. It's a lot of paperwork involved as well, a lot of onerous paperwork, a lot of repetitive paperwork. So we'd like to see a shorter route to settlement for meeting the MIR, a 2-year route, for not meeting so an exceptional route should be capped at 5 years, and simplifying the process. There needs to be, when every time, and when it gets to our sort of renewal, the heart rate goes up, and so here we go again, and the questions can be quite, we get a lot of people extremely worried about answering incorrectly because the consequences are so vast.
Would you accept that some of the systems are in place actually to test the strength of the relationship in the marriage, and whether actually something is genuine or not? I mean, we've all heard about scam marriages. We've all heard about how people offer their services in order to get a piece of paper that then says, oh yes, you're free to stay in the country now forever, and really there wasn't a real marriage or a real relationship there at all. So I'm not envious of the people who have to come to these judgments and set up a rules-based system that explores effectively and fairly how that works. So yes, it'd be nice not to have these rules at all, wouldn't it? And I think and it would be nice to have everything a lot easier and a lot shorter. But I don't think I've really heard from, not just from yourself but from the rest of the panel, what that might look like.
I mean, when we start talking about sham marriages, it's conflating a bit, and I think we as an organisation support and work with genuine couples and families who simply want to be here, and that is who they are. And we have to, the application process is so incredibly intrusive, and there are simpler ways in which you can prove your relationship. But the amount of evidence that you have to give, the photos, the going into your WhatsApp, everything, it's incredibly intrusive, and that shouldn't need to be the case.
I'm very conscious that we are running out of time, so I just want to check, is there anything else you want to ask?
Can I just say one thing
on that
last question, which is, because I suppose
Brendan.
Having a broader remit, I'm a bit more in it. I'm trying to work out how the system works between people and systems, and there needs to be a balance. But I would say I'm in Madeleine Sumption's camp, but when you look at the changes in the 5-point plan, this was a huge outlier, and the rationale did not appear to make sense in the same way that it did for the other changes. Whether you agreed with those changes or not, there seemed to be, coherence there. And I think one of the things that comes out to me a lot from trying to intersect between or intermediate between the Home Office and people like who are on this panel is this side of the debate gets to put their evidence to the Home Office, but rarely do you see what evidence the Home Office are looking at. Everybody assumes that the Home Office are making terrible, unevidence-based decisions, but they are seeing some of the things that you were talking about. The problem is we never see what they're seeing. They never reveal their evidence. And I think talking across the system as a whole, it would be a real eye-opener for people working in policy and for some NGOs if the Home Office said, yeah, I hear you, but here is all the abuse or all the exploitation or all the things going wrong that we see. We don't see what they see, so it's hard to have a rational debate.
That's a very interesting point, actually, because we've certainly asked the Home Office for evidence on a number of occasions, and it's not been forthcoming to the committee. So transparency would be very helpful. Brendan, is there anything you'd like to ask?
Thank you. Yeah, just very, very quickly on that. So, obviously, there's the sort of more clear-cut spousal issues and getting visas for that and what we've done with the amount you have to earn. One of the criticisms in the past, whether it's been social care visas or whatever, is when people have brought relatives over, whether they've been sometimes elderly or have had significant health problems. In experience, have you seen there's a disproportionate of that has gone on? Have you noticed that, obviously we've put things like the surcharge in for the NHS and so on. Has there been almost a problem or a bit of a pushback with that there are some people who have maybe tried to use the system for that, or there's a disproportionately high amount of that coming from certain areas? Jonathan, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I can't really speak to the evidence, but I would see that in exactly the same camp, that there are obviously good reasons for letting some of those people enter the country and reunite with their families. There are clearly also incentives for people to use that to access certain services here, and there is evidence that has, and stories that has happened, and therefore the whole point of the system is to try and get a balance between being fair to people who want to come, but being fair to people who are relying on the system to have a fair rules-based approach.
But if I could just add to that, I think we need to be very careful that we don't, we're not just in effect having a two-tier system where some workers have rights and because they're not on a restrictive visa, and other workers who we have, I reiterate, invited here because our sectors need them, they're treated as commodities. They don't have family rights or in effect the right to get ill, because if they get ill they might be also sacked and lose their visa. So I just think we just need to be very careful that we're not creating a two-tier workforce here.
So we are coming to the end of this session. If there is anything else that you feel we haven't asked you about that you wanted to tell us, would you please write to us with anything extra, and we will certainly consider that. Can I thank all three of you for your contributions this morning? It's been very helpful, really interesting, and thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. We appreciated hearing that, so thank you. Thank you very much, and order, that's the end of the session.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.